There we go. So this is where we left off. We were looking at the different elements in our government to diffuse the power so that power is not held by one individual or one group. There was bicameralism in the legislature. There was checks and balances between the three branches of our new government. And then federalism is the division of powers by one central government and then the smaller divisional governments. In this case, at that time, the 13 states. We're going to look at federalism in depth starting here in a few moments as we transition into chapter 3. An overarching theme of the federal government is the doctrine of separation of powers. This is what came from Montesquieu. And it ties into especially the checks and balances. You have independent branches within the government which hold each other accountable. Now, all of these things were included in our new Constitution, which was completed in 1787. And then they began to, and then the Constitutional Convention did something that they were not authorized to do. Remember, when they came together in May of 1787, they were only going to revise the Articles of Confederation. Well, the Congress at that time had given them some stipulations. Revise the articles, and then when you're done revising it, send your revisions back to the Senate, because all of the delegates that were meeting in Philadelphia were not, it wasn't the Senate that was a part of the Articles of Confederation government. It was the state representatives that each state sent to the Constitutional Convention. So they had to revise the articles, and then when they were done, send it back to the Senate for approval. And then if the Senate was okay with it, all 13 states would have to approve. All 13, 100% approval. So we've already talked about how the representatives, the delegates, hold on a second. Let's put you down here and you go to sleep. All right, there you go. We've already discussed how the delegates under the leadership of James Madison said, let's scrap the articles and come up with a whole new system of government. Well, once the Constitution was done, they once again did not follow the stipulations of the Senate. Instead of sending it to the Senate, who would then send it to the states for a 100% approval, the framers of the Constitution came up with their own standard for accepting the Constitution. They would send it to all 13 states, and once they had 9 states ratify it, it would go into effect. So they're completely bypassing the Senate that was formed under the Articles of Confederation. And instead of having 100% approval by the states, basically about 70%. 9 out of the 13 states had to ratify the federal Constitution in order for it to go into effect. And that took a little over a year, or almost a year, into 1788. So really the Constitution didn't go into effect until 1788. And it wasn't until 1791 that the last 2 states, I believe North Carolina and Rhode Island, they were the last 2 states to finally ratify it. One of the criticisms of the new Constitution, which was a criticism of the Anti-Federalists, was that this gives too much power to a central government, and they will trample on the individual rights of citizens. So there was a call for a Bill of Rights. And this is the final element, along with these things up here: separation of powers, federalism, checks and balances, bicameralism. This is the final element of our Constitution that was added starting in 1791. And these are sometimes called the 10 Amendments to the Constitution. And nowadays they're called the first 10 amendments, since there's now 27 amendments. But these 10 amendments, this Bill of Rights, protected the rights of individuals from a strong national government. We can look at it this way. The concept of federalism made sure that the state governments were protected from an abusive national government. State governments. The Bill of Rights was put into place to protect individuals' rights. And as we're going to talk about in a moment, or maybe Monday, there was a clause, not the Santa Claus, but another clause called the Supremacy Clause, that said that the federal Constitution is the highest law in the land. So what this does, this Bill of Rights does, is it protects individuals' rights from the states, or from the federal government abusing its power. And then the Supremacy Clause basically protects individuals from their state governments. Any questions? You guys look like you're enthused out of your minds. All right. So as we focus now on federalism, we're moving into chapter 3 material, if you want to follow along, although I won't be following exactly the outline of the book. Why federalism? Our founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, after studying all the French political philosophers like Hobbes and Locke and Montesquieu, and experiencing the abuses of the British government, came to believe strongly in the idea of limited government. Limited government. Make sure you understand that concept. This is a concept or a principle that we believe in strongly as Americans. That government needs to be limited in its power. They were convinced from experience that, okay, you gotta stop. They were convinced that government leaders that have power and authority will gravitate towards threatening individual liberty. That's just going to be a tendency. And that's why all of those concepts are a part of our federal government, so that too much power does not become invested in one person or one body. And therefore, federalism was absolutely essential in our framers' minds, so that government power would be restrained and that's why we divide government into independent institutions. That way, the tendency to abuse power will be diffused. I apologize. I have a really needy cat for some reason this morning. She's not wanting to lay down and sleep. So here's the definition of federalism. It is a system of government, and when we talk about system of government, we're thinking of a system that's different than a monarchy or a dictatorship, or even a parliamentary. England would have been considered a not a democracy, but maybe a constitutional monarchy, because they had a constitution, but they also had a king, and then they had parliament. But remember, our government is set up so that the Constitution is the law of the land. And so we would have a government that's based on the rule of law, not the rule of an individual or the rule of a body. So it's a system of government where a written constitution divides the powers on a territorial basis between the central or national government and several regional governments. And again, at the time, we had 13 regional governments or 13 states. And actually, I believe lay down up there. Good thing. I believe Massachusetts is actually called a commonwealth, not a state. So we have this system of government with a constitution so that there's rule of law, and then the division of powers through those two different governments, national and regional. Now, here's a chart that shows you the differences between these different systems. And we can illustrate this with Britain and the United States. When we were under Britain, we were under a unitary system. The national government had the power, and there were state governments that were accountable to the national government. So think about King George in Parliament in London, and they're ruling over the 13 colonies. And it was King George in the Parliament that assigned the governors of each state. And if the states had parliaments, they were allowed, some were allowed to do so based on voting in the state, but this was all upon the approval of the national government. When we had the Articles of Confederation, we were a confederation system. The state governments had more power, and the national government that was set up was more of a friendship or a federation between the state governments. And remember, there was only a Congress in the national government. So we moved to a federal system, kind of an in-between, except for the people, right? The people have the authority, and they elect their national leaders and state leaders to be the government, but a government that's divided in power, that is built on the authority of the people. As Abraham Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address, or I'm sorry, yeah, in his Gettysburg Address, we are a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. All righty, how are the powers divided? Okay. Under the Constitution, our national government is given or delegated certain powers. You wrote about several of those powers of Congress in your brief. The power to tax, the power to regulate trade with foreign countries, the power to form a militia, some of those powers. And some of those powers are clearly expressed in the Constitution, like the power to tax. It is written, and so it is expressed very clearly. Some powers are not written clearly, but they are implied. Okay, you gotta be still. You're causing problems. And then there are powers that are inherent as a national government. So for example, if there was a terrorist attack, which we saw happen yesterday, and even though it was in another country, they did attack and kill. Last time I heard, if it's changed, somebody let me know. 13 of our US military. One of the inherent powers of the federal government is that they can pursue and bring to justice the terrorists who did this. For example, those 13 soldiers, most likely, well, it's a good chance that they came from 13 different states. Most likely a couple of them were from the same state. So, but they're serving in the federal military. So let's say there was a soldier from Texas that was killed. The state of Texas is not going to pursue the terrorists. That is an inherent power of the federal government, since they attacked and killed federal soldiers. All right, now, the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights was an amendment that gave certain powers or reserved certain powers to the state governments. So the state governments have powers. There are certain powers that are reserved only for the states. Just an example off the top of my head, thinking about Carl Albert, your school that you're a student at. The federal government has no power to say we want to start a college in Oklahoma. That is reserved for the state of Oklahoma. And so the colleges that have been started in our state, the colleges that we have, including Carl Albert, were started because the state had the power to form institutions of higher learning. Now, we do have some federal institutions of higher learning. West Point is a military academy, which cadets in the Army can go and get college degrees and become trained military officers. But as far as starting colleges in the state of Oklahoma, that's reserved for the state. So there's reserve powers that the states have that the national government doesn't have. And then you'll notice here that there's an area where the two governments overlap. These are concurrent powers. That means con usually means with. So they share these powers with each other. And that would be powers to tax, because state governments can also tax. Federal government, we know they tax. So concurrent powers. There are powers that are denied on the basis of delegated powers and reserve powers. So make sure you read those sections about the different kinds of powers that are granted by the Constitution and that are also implied or reserved, the 10th Amendment for the states. You'll need to know those different powers for the test. These slides, I should have been showing these slides to you as I was going over these things. The delegated powers that are expressed are spelled out in Article 1, Section 18, and they give 27 powers to the national government, specifically the legislature. The legislative branch. Now, there are some other clauses. There are some other clauses that you're going to have to know along with the supremacy clause. And once again, none of them are called the Santa Clause. All right. You've got the necessary and proper clause, which has also been called the elastic clause, because it means it kind of gives flexibility to Congress to do what.
Can I have Madison Ponticelli come to the office, please? Madison Ponticelli.
That gave me a fright. Okay. Are you still with me? All right. We'll end it on this clause here, and we'll call it a day and go home to the house early. It's elastic, that is, it's flexible, because it allows Congress to do what they deem to be necessary and proper for the benefit of the United States citizens. You can see some of the things that are included in this. To do things that are beneficial for commerce, like build highways or construct highways and roads, to dig canals, to have a U.S. postal system. Actually, that might be a part of another section. So you see how that can be elastic, how that can be flexible. It's really going to be in the eyes of those that are serving in the legislature, what they deem necessary and proper. Let me cover inherent and then we'll be done. Sorry. Inherent powers are not written in the Constitution, but they do belong only to the national government. Like I said earlier, tracking down these terrorists that are responsible for the deaths of our U.S. military. Another big thing that is really a hot button issue in our nation, regulating immigration. And other things like protecting the nation. These are inherent powers. Again, they are not expressly written in the Constitution. So any questions on those things? How about any of the assignments or anything else not related to the content? Well, we will see you then on Monday. Have a wonderful weekend. Keep up the sense of humor. All right. We'll talk to you later.